In the headlines, the long overdue vice ministerial talks between Korea and Japan were viewed as a possible turning point in the two nations' deteriorating relationship. But no such luck, with Japan's chief cabinet secretary making negative comments about Korean victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery. Representatives from the Korean Medical Association and the government agreed to sit down and talk to try and resolve their differences before a 6-day nationwide doctor strike kicks in later this month. And at least 4 people are killed and dozens more injured after 2 buildings in New York City's East Harlem neighborhood are brought down by an explosion. Early investigation results point to gas leaks as the root cause. These plus much more coming up in Early Edition at 6.
당신의 유럽은 어디였나요?
Excellence in flight. Korean Air.
It is 5 a.m. in Ottawa, 5 p.m. in Beijing, and 6 on a Thursday evening here in Seoul. Welcome to Early Edition at 6. I'm Moon Gan-young.
And I'm Daniel Che. Thank you for joining us.
There were hopes that Korea and Japan would begin the process of mending their chilly ties during the first vice ministerial talks in 8 months on Wednesday.
But while diplomats were meeting in Seoul, Japan's chief cabinet secretary was busy throwing cold water on those hopes, making negative comments about Korea's so-called comfort women. Our foreign affairs correspondent Hwang Sung-hee starts us off.
South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs slammed Japan on Thursday for its latest offensive remarks about the victims of Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of women.
Japan is inflicting another wound on the surviving victims of sexual enslavement by denying its military's direct involvement, which it had previously acknowledged in the Kono Statement.
The Kono Statement is a landmark apology issued by Japan in 1993 to the 200,000 or so women, mostly Korean, who were forced into sexual slavery during the Second World War. Tokyo has been backtracking on that apology in recent months by calling into question the validity of testimony given by Korean women that established the basis of the statement. Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said Wednesday at a press briefing that there was no evidence that Japan forced the recruitment of women. The comments came on the same day the two neighbors were holding their first high-level talks in 8 months, which ended without results. Speculation leading up to the talks was that Japan would propose a summit with South Korea on the sidelines of the Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague later this month. More than a year into office now, President Park Geun-hye has yet to sit down with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. President Park has said she would not meet with a leader who fails to acknowledge his country's historical wrongdoings.
The South Korean government believes it is important to engage in talks when the two leaders can reach productive outcomes rather than holding talks for talk's sake.
Seoul's foreign ministry says that Japan must first take sincere steps to settle the history issues in order to hold productive talks with South Korea. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
Now, on a similar note, Korea's gender equality minister says the reason violence against women continues is because past wrongs have never been corrected, pointing particularly to the issue of sexual slavery by the Japanese military during World War II. Speaking at Columbia University in New York on Wednesday, Minister Cho Yun-sun stressed that the issue of sexual slavery between Korea and Japan is related to the ongoing abuses against women in troubled parts of the world. She urged young people to ensure that the kinds of women's rights abuses seen during the war are never repeated. The U.S. state of New York is inching closer to using the name East Sea for the body of water between Korea and Japan. A Korean-American community group there says the New York State Senate's Judiciary Committee passed a bill Tuesday requiring both East Sea and Sea of Japan be used in all school textbooks published after July 1st. The legislation will take effect if it is passed by both state houses and signed by the governor. A similar bill was passed by lawmakers in Virginia last month and is awaiting the Virginia governor's approval. The death toll from Wednesday's New York City building explosion has now risen to 6 as rescuers continue to search for those who remain unaccounted for. The exact cause has not been determined, but authorities suspect a gas leak is to blame. Arirang's Hwang Sung-hee has the latest.
New York City's mayor has called it a tragedy of the worst kind. 2 buildings in the city's East Harlem neighborhood completely collapsed on Wednesday morning local time. Thick smoke and debris covered the neighborhood. Nearby structures were badly damaged by what witnesses say was a massive explosion. Residents close to the incident have been evacuated.
It blew out some of our windows, like in the back of the building. The whole courtyard had glass in it, and like my apartment shook.
New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio rushed to the scene to take stock of the situation and spoke at an emergency press conference.
There was a major explosion that destroyed 2 buildings. Explosion was based on a gas leak. The impact affected buildings around the 2 that were destroyed. Very heavy impact on the surrounding buildings. A heavy fire has ensued as well.
A resident in an adjacent building reported smelling gas just 15 minutes prior to the blast. Other people in the neighborhood have also told reporters they had smelled a gas-like odor since the day before. The New York Fire Department has classified the incident as the highest threat level possible. Around 250 firemen were on site after it occurred, and there are dozens still searching for the missing, feared trapped under the debris. Mayor de Blasio praised the city's fire department for its quick response, especially as there was no indication in time to save people. The White House says President Barack Obama was briefed on the incident and has sent his condolences to the victims' families. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
Shifting our focus back to Korea, there were no surprises in final rate-setting session for outgoing Bank of Korea Governor Kim Jong-soo, whose 4-year term ends at the end of this month. The central bank has left its key interest rate unchanged at 2.5% for the 10th straight month in March. Following its monthly monetary policy meeting on Thursday, the BOK said the economy at home and abroad are continuing to recover at a moderate pace, but did note the risks coming from emerging markets. The nation's inflation rate ran below the central bank's target band for the 21st straight month in February, standing at 1%. And the country's 3 mobile carriers are facing even more penalties as they enter a 45-day government-ordered suspension of business on this Thursday. The Korea Communications Commission says it will levy more than 30 billion won or $28 million in fines on all 3 carriers for igniting unfair competition and overheating the market in January and February. The KCC will also suspend leading mobile carrier SK Telecom and the number 3 player LG U+ for 7 and 14 days respectively. That's on top of the 45-day suspension issued by the ICT Ministry on all 3 carriers for providing illegal subsidies to lure potential customers. During the suspension, the companies are banned from signing up new customers.
Now, Finance Minister Hyun Woo-seok said that Seoul will continue to push for more bilateral trade pacts with Southeast Asian countries as part of the government's drive to improve the trading environment for small and mid-sized companies.
But concerns still linger about Korea's seemingly insatiable appetite for free trade deals. Our Na Young-kyung reports.
It's been 10 years since Korea signed its first bilateral free trade agreement with Chile. Since then, the trade volume between the two countries has increased more than fourfold, topping $7 billion last year. The Korean government has been signing many more FTAs over the last decade, with the most recent concluded negotiation being Seoul's trade pact with Canada. The local automobile and auto parts industry will likely benefit the most when the Canada deal takes effect. The Korea-US FTA will welcome its 2-year anniversary on Saturday, but opinions about whether the Korean economy has benefited from the much-contested deal over the past 2 years have been mixed. Last year, the government said Seoul's trade surplus with Washington jumped 44% compared to before the deal was ratified. But some industry experts say improved exports to the U.S. were on the back of a recovery in advanced economies rather than the bilateral trade deal. It remains to be seen whether the government and experts will be able to evaluate the economic effects of the Korea-US deal with one voice this year. Another trade deal drawing much attention is the Korea-China FTA. The 10th round of negotiations will take place in Korea this month. The draft for tariff concession on highly sensitive items, mostly being agricultural products from Korea, has been exchanged and will be discussed in detail at the upcoming talks. Although analysts estimate Korea's GDP will increase by up to 3% in the 10 years after the deal is signed, skeptics say the bilateral pact will devastate Korea's agricultural sector. Those for and against the government's initiative to sign more free trade deals continue to lock horns, and it's still unclear whether the government's ongoing FTA negotiations will help or harm the Korean economy. 나현경, Arirang News.
Now, in line with that, Korea and Canada have concluded negotiations on a bilateral free trade agreement that, once implemented, is expected to significantly boost bilateral trade between the two countries.
The announcement earlier this week puts an end to nearly a decade of on-again, off-again talks and marks Ottawa's first free trade foray into the Asia-Pacific region.
So, for a closer look at the significance and implications of Korea's 12th FTA, we are joined live in the studio by Dr. Kang Jun-ha, Professor of Law at Seoul-based Hongik University. Dr. Kang, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Korea is one of the global leaders in this drive to sign FTAs, and Korea-Canada FTA is the latest one. And with the signing of this, we are hearing reports that Korea now covers 62% of the global economy. What is the significance of this?
FTA is process to integrate one economy to another and to expand economic territory. And FTA is described to economic highway between those two countries to facilitate trade and investments. So the first meaning for Korea-Canada FTA is to strengthen the economic relations each other. When you take a look at Korea-Canada FTA, it covers not only trade in goods, but also trade in services, investment, intellectual property rights, government procurement, labor, environment, so on. So it's truly a comprehensive deal. So I think Korea-Canada FTA may deepen both countries' economic cooperation. Second, by completing FTA negotiation with Canada, Korea can maintain strong economic ties with most major economies in the world. Canada is 11th largest economy in the world. Korea already concluded FTA with US and EU. So Korean government right now successfully built FTA network with major economies. Third, Korea becomes the first Asian country to have bilateral FTA with Canada. The deal will help the Korean presence in Canadian market.
Okay, it's quite a significant achievement for both countries, but let's put this in a very simple, basic, down-low fact. Korea-Canada FTA, is it a good deal for South Korea or a failed trade for both countries, or maybe are we going in maybe at a disadvantageous position?
We always have some positive and negative sides and impact on domestic industry from FTA. So under Korea-Canada FTA, both countries agreed to gradually phase out tariff on most goods within 10 years after entering into force of FTA. Canada will start to progressively abolish tariff on Korean cars. Tariff rate is 6.1%. within 2 years. Not only automobile, but also car component. The tariff for car component will be eliminated will be 3 years, within 3 years. And electronic goods, including refrigerator and washing machine, tariff on that items will be eliminated will be 3 years or immediately. Such elimination of tariff will provide a boost for Korea's export to Canada. And most vulnerable area from the FTA is agricultural industry. Under the agreement, the 40% tariff on Canadian beef will be phased out within 15 years. And tariff on pork product will be also removed within 13 years. However, a total of 211 items, including rice, powdered milk, and cheese, are excluded from the tariff elimination schedule. So with the conclusion of Korea-Canada FTA, Canadian beef will compete with US and Austrian beef in Korean market.
Australian beef, of course.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about Korea's willingness or efforts to join the TPP Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course, it being a huge, giant free trade deal among U.S. and Canada and 10 other countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, will this, and if it does, how will this impact Korea's participation in the TPP?
TPP is, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is a bigger and larger economy. And right now, 12 countries are participating in TPP negotiation. And Korea already expressed intention to join the TPP negotiation. However, in order to join TPP, prior approval from the contracting states are required. So right now, Korea continues to talk with contracting states. And by concluding FTA with Canada, Canada may support Korea's position to join TPP.
Well, the hardest deal to strike is the one with closer peers or families or closer neighbors. So what can we expect to see in the FTA negotiations with China and Japan?
Korea now conduct FTA negotiation with Japan, China, and we have a trilateral FTA negotiation, Korea, Japan, China. As for Korea-Japan FTA, virtually negotiation is stopped due to core issues, especially for the level of trade liberalization. And as for Korea-China FTA, up to now, 9 negotiation rounds were held. It is hard to expect when the deal is done, but the delegation tried to bridge the gap in many issues. And China is really an important trade partner for Korea. So we have to carefully watch the progress in the negotiation. And we have another trilateral FTA negotiation, as I mentioned before, Korea, China, Japan. And up to now, 4 rounds of meetings were held. And 3 different FTA negotiations are somewhat linked together. So we have to watch closely the progress each of negotiation.
Well, if Korea does indeed sign FTAs with China and Japan, it will have a free trade agreement with the world's first, second, and third largest economies. So that would be something significant that we should keep a close eye on.
That's right.
All right, Dr. Kang Jun-ha, Professor of Law at Hwang University. Thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
We apologize.
We're all destroyed.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life. Talking with you on air and online. Connecting you with experts on the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best with Moon Gon-young and Daniel Che on Early Edition at 6.
Proposal for talks on holding regular reunions for families separated by the Korean War. Their reason.
President Park Geun-hye says it will be impossible to achieve economic innovation, national unity, or even reunification so long as unlawfulness and public disorder persist in Korean society to protect vested interests. At the Korean National Police University's graduation ceremony Thursday, the Korean leader then asked the graduates to do their civic duty and prevent society from turning a blind eye to illegal forms of collective action. She also said her push to root out irregularities in society starts with putting law and principles on the right path. Meanwhile, there is rising hope Korean doctors and the government will be able to talk through their differences and avert an upcoming 6-day doctor strike planned for the last week of the month. Our Song Ji-sun reports on the issues dividing the two sides.
Medical doctors and the governments are preparing for a meeting after Prime Minister Chung Hong-won proposed talks by March 20th to seek a compromise. The Korean Medical Association of Doctors, upset over government's plan to implement telemedicine and to set up for-profit subsidiaries, is planning a 6-day strike for March 24th unless an agreement is reached. Doctors claim the government's plan could undermine public health. The government, on the other hand, says the new telemedicine system is necessary to offer benefits to the elderly, disabled, and patients in remote areas, along with people with chronic diseases. The doctors are also calling for a reform of the current public health plan, saying it earns them unreasonably low consultation fees, but at the same time burdens the public because of the high costs for services not covered by the state-run health system. Many Koreans rely on private insurance as the public health plan does not cover the full range of expenses. Medical fees in Korea are relatively cheaper than those of most developed countries. For example, artery bypass surgery in Korea costs 1/6 of what it costs in the US. Hospitals have been accused of offsetting their losses by advising patients that they undergo costly checkup services like the MRIs. An OECD survey shows the pace of rise in medical spending is the second highest in Korea among member countries. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
We shift our focus up north this time. It looks like the execution last year of North Korea's second-in-command, Chang Song-taek, has had an impact on the political future of his wife, Kim Young-hee, who is also the aunt of leader Kim Jong-un. After a recent parliamentary election, Kim was listed as a member of the Supreme People's Assembly. But South Korean intelligence officials said Thursday that Kim, who is listed, appears to be a person with the same name, was also present in previous elections. That Kim represented North Pyeongan-bukdo province, the same constituency that Kim Young-hee was elected to represent in this year's election. An official at the Unification Ministry said key officials were elected in constituencies in Pyongyang, and there appears to be little reason for the young leaders on to run for a seat away from the capital city. And the annual session of China's top legislature came to a close this Thursday, with various government bodies outlining how they will carry out wide-ranging reforms, from fighting corruption and chronic pollution to the challenges facing the Chinese economy this year. The nation's premier outlined the goals in a closing news conference. Our Kim Young-gil has more.
The nearly 3,000 delegates of the National People's Congress ended their 10-day annual session this Thursday. In a press conference to close out the NPC, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang said this year's event was successful in defining major missions and setting specific goals. They included fighting corruption, setting a target for economic growth, and cutting down on the nation's chronic pollution problem. On corruption, Li said there will be zero tolerance for corrupt behavior or corrupt officials, and that those who are found guilty of violating the laws of the country will be punished to the full extent of the law. On the government's growth forecast of 7.5%, Li said China had the capabilities to ensure that economic growth will stay in a reasonable range this year, while also acknowledging the severe challenges facing the economy, namely downward pressure. Last year, China's growth rate settled at a pace of 7.7%. Li also outlined measures the NPC laid out for tackling pollution. They included shutting down 50,000 small coal-fired furnaces, reducing sulfur and nitrogen emissions from coal-burning power plants, removing old high-emission cars from roads, and promoting cleaner diesel-fueled vehicles. The Chinese premier also used the opportunity to speak about missing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, calling on all relevant parties to enhance coordination to ensure that the plane is located as quickly as possible. 김영길, Arirang News.
Well, let's now get a check on the weather forecast with our Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle, we're into the middle of March, which is usually the start of spring. So when will the warm weather stick around for good?
Well, the temperature dropped right now, but we can expect them to go up again tomorrow.
Okay, Michelle, so how warm are we talking about?
By the afternoon, it will feel like spring outside, and we can expect another cloudy day, but the temperature gaps will remain quite large, at least a 10-degree temperature gap between the mornings and nights, and so make sure to dress warm. Now, going over to our readings, Seoul drops down to -1 degrees in the morning and gets up to 10 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will peak both at 9. Now, moving over to other regions, Jeju peaks at 9, Dokdo makes it up to 4, and Mangkeumgang tops down to -4. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you guys.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And that brings us to the end of our newscast. Thank you for watching. This has been Daniel Chan.
And I'm Moon Gon-young. Thank you as always for being here with us. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and we'll see you right back here, same time tomorrow. Good night.